Shalom, welcome to the Jewish View. My name is Rabbi Nachman Simon with the Chabad House of Delmar, together with my co-host Mark Ronich of Statewide News Service, jbiztechphilly.com. And as you can see here, now columnist for the Jewish Press.
I have a column called Albany Beat, and I'm enjoying doing that and everything else, but we talk about how government relates to the Jewish community or it doesn't. And in this case, we have someone who relates to the Jewish community very well. Steve Sanders, a former assemblyman, currently with the group called ACTS, which is an acronym for
Agency for Children's Therapy Services.
So welcome to the Jewish View.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much for having me, Rabbi.
Excellent.
Pleasure.
What is ACTS? Start from the beginning. It sounds like a good name, but
Yeah,
what do you advocate?
ACTS is a very good name. Agencies for Children's Therapy Services is an amalgam of about 36 private agencies that provide preschool special education for youngsters who have disabilities, and even before they are of the age of preschool, they provide something called early intervention, which is services.
What age would be there? Around 2 years old?
0,
Really?
as early as a youngster can be identified with a developmental delay or disability. It could be a few weeks, a few months, a year, but that's basically 0 to 3. And then from about 3 to 4 to 5 years old, you have preschool special ed. And what you hope, of course, and I should just say parenthetically, the last job that I had in the legislature when I was in the State Assembly, as Mark mentioned, I was chair of the Assembly Education Committee for the last 11 years of my time in the Assembly. And one thing that I know, I mean, there are a lot of theories about education, what works, what doesn't work. One thing that I think everybody agrees on, where there's a lot of disagreement in education, is that the earlier that you are able to get youngsters in a structured education program comparable to their age, age appropriate, and especially if youngsters have educational learning delays or disabilities, the earlier you get them into an educational program, provide services, provide the help, the much greater chance that that youngster, when they hit school age and beyond, will be able to succeed.
And they can diagnose it so early?
It's amazing. Yeah. I'm not a clinician, so don't ask me how they do it, but most of my companies, the 35, 36 companies that are part of ACTS, provide evaluations, diagnostic services, either for preschool special ed or early intervention. And there are benchmarks, you can tell. A normally developing child will usually begin to crawl at a certain age, begin to walk at a certain age, begin to speak words at a certain age, begin to have certain motor skills at a certain age. And oftentimes what happens, unless there is something at birth, which is identified right away, what very often happens is that a parent, they read books, they have experience to some extent, and they suspect that their child is not developing in the normal chronology and will go to their pediatrician. And that usually leads to the next step and the next step, and there's an evaluation.
It's interesting. I have a few sons that teach in Brooklyn, and of course the day school, the Jewish day schools, and by like second grade, they see that something's wrong, they're not keeping up. And then they actually teach. I give them a lot of credit. I don't know if I'm able to do it myself, to teach these classes they're small classes, and they even have an assistant because that they need extra help. But it's interesting you're saying that, because I say, well, when do they figure out this child is not really keeping up? Second grade. That's what I said, by 1 year old.
They're 7 years old by the time.
Yeah, I know. That's what I'm saying. So that's why I was a little amazed you're saying by.
Well, and it depends on the disability. If the disability is more casual, I say casual, but
More pronounced.
If it's less pronounced, sometimes you don't see it right away. Sometimes it only really begins to occur on some of the little tests that a lot of kids, even the second and third grade, are now getting. Sometimes you see it in the test. Sometimes a teacher in the first or second grade will realize that the youngster is not picking up the writing or doing the comprehension.
They can't sit in their seat straight. That's a lot
Well,
of
you know,
times.
look, neither can I sometimes. But now we have a diagnosis for that. That's called attention deficit disorder. And when I was going to public schools in New York City, I remember there were a lot of kids who used to squirm around and couldn't seem to concentrate, and we just thought that they were not well behaved. Or some of them were just kind of, we thought, stupid, which is not a good word to use. Now, with science and understanding, we know that there are reasons why youngsters don't behave like all of their peers, and sometimes it's because there is something going on, some kind of disability.
Do you advocate drugs? I mean, because that's a big idea. I know my son again says, oh, you know, I once heard that a third of children, of all children, are on Ritalin. I mean, not only the people with kids that are developed or something's wrong with them, but I mean, there's a lot of drugs on the kids, and you know, I don't know. I'm still working it out myself. That's why I'm asking you stuff, because I have a parent. And he says, they want to put my kid on Ritalin. Well, now he's at college, and he's Cooper Union, he's very, very smart. And you see he's a little bit jittery, but, you know, even still at that age, but he says, I wouldn't have had my kid if, you know, he's so smart, he's so intelligent. So it's still that kind of a overdosing or over-prescribing, I should say, drugs. I mean,
I think drugs are a very last resort.
Oh,
I think that I think that until fairly recently, when youngsters were hard to deal with, the simple answer was, well, let's apply some medication, let's calm the youngster down. I think that the literature now, the medical literature, the scientific literature, seems to mostly agree that a medication intervention is something that really is to be avoided unless it absolutely, there is no other resort, you know, because you can't have kids just acting out and causing sometimes violence and, you know, being a little destructive. But usually, in most cases, there is another path to helping that youngster. So you want to avoid medication.
About 4 years ago, you wrote a letter to the editor about that there's fraud in special education. Is it still true today?
I think
well,
that,
what would be the fraud? Start from the beginning.
No. He's gonna
Yeah, all right,
explain
so
that.
explain
Well,
what you think the fraud is.
I think that for some years, for some period of time, and what I'm about to say is not unique to the special education field. I think you find abuses in almost any industry, but there were too many cases that were being documented by the state controller's office as a result of audits, other government agencies that oversee programs that provide services, whether they're special education or other services, whereby the provider was not doing what the provider should have been doing and was not always providing all the services, yet pocketing a lot of money and indicating that there were costs that they were incurring, which they'd be reimbursed by the state for, in most cases, that were really not legitimate costs. And I think that, especially when you're dealing with youngsters, very young children, you want to make sure that the providers are absolutely honest and there is zero tolerance for people who would try to scam the system. So fortunately, I think that over time, because of the exposure of some of these folks that you know were not really honest, I think most of that is over. In fact, the state controller, Tom DiNapoli, has been auditing every single preschool special education program in the state as a result of some of these revelations that Mark alluded to some years ago, and the vast majority of those audits now turn up no fraud, turn up nothing that is dishonest, which is going on. And I'll just say this in conclusion. My experience with providers of services for very young children, my experience is that number one, it's a very hard job. Number two, these are 99 out of 100 of these folks are hardworking, dedicated. They really care about the kids. They really care about the families. They put in 50 and 60-hour weeks trying to provide the right kind of services for these youngsters. And I think they're succeeding. And as I say, every industry has its outliers. I think that we have been able to deal with some of the outliers that were practicing in preschool special ed.
Right, excellent.
I wanted to also bring up the autism spectrum. Assemblyman Angelo Santa Barbara has a son who's on the autism spectrum, I believe. Are you, like, when you have to advocate for an issue, is he your go-to guy?
He's certainly one of the people who are knowledgeable. It's very interesting. I have found, especially because autism has become so prevalent, or at least its identification has become very, very prevalent. And that's not unique to New York State. If you look at the national studies and the international studies, the diagnosis of autism or a child on the spectrum has become a phenomena that is worldwide. Where it used to be something like one child out of 100 that is diagnosed with autism, that number has doubled and tripled.
What's the
over last
reason,
10
do they
years.
say?
Well,
Why? That's the big question.
I think they know more about it, and
Well,
that they can diagnose it better, and that there's a spectrum now, and it's just not, oh, he's acting out, or it's not another excuse. They automatically have something to label that attitude with.
Rabbi Simon's question
Yeah.
is really a good one, and your answer, I think, is a partial explanation of why there is so much.
For the rest of it.
Well, I'm not going to be very enlightening, because what I was about to say is that it is a phenomena that even the scientists and the medical people can't quite put their finger on. They know that more youngsters are being diagnosed, being on the spectrum. One body of thought is that autism has always existed in these numbers. We were just not as smart in identifying this as we are with a lot of different ailments. That's one explanation.
Right, that was the one I was getting at.
There are others, though, that believe that there may be environmental reasons. There might be nutritional reasons why a mother who gives birth to a child today in 2016, that there's a greater chance that that child may have autism than in 1946 or 1956. And the studies of the possible environmental causes, possible I say,
Yes.
is still many years away from really having a complete picture. So what we know is that around the world, more kids are being diagnosed every year with autism. We don't exactly know whether there is more autism today than there was 30 or 40 years ago, or whether the evaluations and diagnoses are more precise than they were 30 or 40 years
Are
ago.
there other people in the legislature, other elected officials in the legislature who have children with autism?
Yes, and that was what I was about to allude to. I have found that the very best legislative advocates, and there are a number of them,
Yeah.
because I think there is this sensitivity, as there should be, for children who start out in life with one or even two strikes against them, and the angst that these families have to go through. I mean, you think about it, every family, all they want is a healthy little baby boy or girl. When you ask any parent who's about to have a child and you say, well, what do you prefer, a little boy or a little girl? Invariably they'll say, I just want a healthy baby. So, you sort of imagine, if you haven't experienced it yourself, the angst that these families go through when they find out their children are not perfect. The best advocates in the legislature are those advocates who have some family connection with disabilities, either a grandparent or a parent or a friend of someone, and there are more and more of them in the Assembly and the Senate. And fortunately, there are a lot of go-to people. There are a lot of people with a great deal of compassion and sympathy in the legislature.
Okay, if you start naming names, you're going to leave someone out.
Yeah,
so
that's
why you
always the
don't wanna-
problem.
Okay. Is there, now, in your time when you were with in the 11 years you were chair of the Assembly Education Committee, you know, this is special education, falls under that committee.
Correct.
Are you worlds apart in terms of your understanding now as to what it was then in terms of special education and therapy services?
Well, I have a broader perspective now. When I was in the legislature, as we mentioned, the last 11 years I was chair of the Education Committee, and yes, special ed is certainly within that purview. Before that, I was chair of a committee which at the time was called the Committee on Mental Health, Mental Retardation, and Developmental Disabilities. We don't use the word retardation anymore. So we now just refer to youngsters or adults as people with disabilities, because the term retardation is really thought to be a very kind of negative term, so we don't use that anymore. But because I had this legislative background dealing with disabilities, first with that committee that deals specifically with disabilities and mental health, and then later education, I had a pretty good grasp of the issues that citizens of the state face as it relates to disabilities. It really wasn't, though, until after I left the legislature and started working directly with providers that I really more intimately understood in a more of a microcosm that which I understood in an intellectual way when I was chair of those committees. You know, I sort of understood, you know, the kind of laws and regulations we need, but working with providers who work with families, and I've been exposed now to an awful lot of families who face these challenges, my understanding is much deeper now. I think the one thing I can say now, having been spent most of my adult life in the legislature, and this chapter of my adult life working around the legislature, outside of it, is that when you are a lawmaker, your experience is somewhat confined. First of all, you have to deal with a lot of issues. You can't really focus on any one particular area of concern for me. I mean, there are 100 issues. You know, the budget, as we know, deals with a myriad of important matters. It was only after I left the legislature that I really became much more knowledgeable about how these ailments and these disabilities affect tens and tens of thousands of New Yorkers. And it's been through working with the providers and working with the families.
Which district did you represent?
East side of Manhattan.
Okay.
So if your viewers are not that familiar with the geography of Manhattan, a lot of people know where the UN building is, or have a view of that. The UN building was part of my district.
Okay.
My district went from Delancey Street. A lot of people may not know Delancey Street,
really?
but went down to Delancey Street and up the east side to the UN and even north of the UN, mostly east of Fifth Avenue to the East River.
So who succeeded you in the legislature?
Well, very, very briefly. I left.
In 05.
I left at the end of '05, which was actually in the middle of a legislative term. And a woman by the name of Sylvia Friedman won a special election, and she served for a little less than a year.
Okay.
And then she, unfortunately for Sylvia, lost the primary to Brian Kavanaugh,
Okay. Who's
Assemblyman
still there
Kavanaugh,
today?
who is there today, and he's now been the assembly member for 10 years. Goes by fast.
It does, yeah.
Do you work with the assembly? I mean, are you looking for new legislation or money from the New York State government? I mean, are you working actively with the assembly?
The answer is yes and yes.
Yeah.
And probably yes again.
Yeah.
Part of my job as executive director of ACTS is, first of all, to promote policies which are, at least in our judgment, good for the disability community, especially very young kids. So, first of all, you want to promote good ideas, and sometimes promoting good ideas means going to an assembly member or a senator and talking about an issue, and maybe that issue becomes a legislative bill, and maybe if you're lucky, it might even become law. So promoting good policy is a big part of my job. Opposing bad policy takes up almost as much time.
Really?
And when I say bad policy, I think that by and large, all policies that are proposed either by the governor or the legislature is done with good intentions. Nobody wants to hurt the disability community, but because there isn't as great an awareness about how some policies, you know, when they roll out in their small detail, how they might actually affect programs. There are always unintended consequences. So part of my job, aside from promoting good policies, is to look at proposals which are at times made and may not be as good as the governor or the legislature thinks it is, or they may not really understand all the facets and all the ramifications. So opposing bad ideas, at least in our judgment, is a big part of the job, and money is always important. You know, I'll just say this: money alone does not make for a good program, but most programs, whether it's in education or whether it's in any other area, health, mental health, disabilities, you need the requisite amount of funding to produce programs that will be effective. And the balance is how much do you need, and not to be wasteful in spending, especially with tight budgets, which we have every year. We seem to have tight budgets.
I have a couple of questions. Do you know, like, when you go in and you talk to a legislator or you talk to the speaker, whoever that might be at the time, you might say, I know that there's money in this program that could fund this, and because you've been behind, you know, on both sides of the fence, so maybe you have that extra edge to advocate where you know where they could take the money from if they wanted to.
Well, 11 years ago I did, but I've been out now 11 years, and the budget has changed a lot over the last decade. And what I try not to do, I don't think it's effective. I didn't think it was effective when I was an assemblyman, and I don't think it's effective now to try to pit one program against another and to say, you know, I know there's money here, and maybe we're spending a little too much here, so why don't you move that money from there to here? You know, I think it is a wiser course of action to let legislators figure that out.
Oh, really? Okay.
It does. It's wiser. It doesn't always work, mind you.
Right.
But I think my job is to identify what is needed,
Okay.
and it is the legislature's job and the governor's job to figure out
You could
where
help
that
it-
money should come
but you
from.
could help it along a little.
Well,
they're not getting it, so to speak.
I've tried to hint a little bit,
Okay.
but I'm also mindful of the fact that I try to be very respectful of.
As you would want them to be respectful of you when you were in the assembly.
Well, yeah. I mean, bear in
understand.
mind that for 28 years I was on the other side of the lobbying table. I was being lobbied,
Right.
and I guess for myself, I kind of got a sense of what works.
Yeah.
When you are being lobbied, so I try to apply some of those principles to, you know, what appealed to me
Sure.
when I was in the legislature in my approach to current legislators.
Let me ask you this other personal question, if you don't mind. The reason the main reason I think that you had left. I mean, you're a thin guy, you know, you look healthy, you look like you used to jog or still jog, whatever, but you had quadruple bypass. You went in for a three-way bypass and went into a quadruple bypass at Beth Israel Hospital.
Right.
You know, how are you feeling? Is everything okay? Did you have to go for another procedure, or is things okay?
I feel great.
Yeah.
What keeps me active today, very active, is I have a 2-year-old Shih Tzu dog.
Okay.
When my wife and I acquired Mocha, we thought we were getting a pet. We didn't realize we were getting a daughter. So, and she's very active, so that keeps me very active,
Right.
chasing after her. We love her to pieces. Yeah, I'm doing very well. Thank you for asking, Mark. I did need a few tune-ups
Okay.
after the quadruple bypass, so I had an additional stent and something called an ablation. In my case, there was a lot of family history.
Oh.
And I think a lot of people who have cardiac issues is, you know, lifestyle, diet, that's all part of it. But there was some family history there. I'll just say this, it was a total surprise to me, and this might be instructive to your viewers. I was virtually asymptomatic. I didn't exhibit any of the traditional symptoms when you were about to have a heart attack. I did have a heart attack during that whole time.
During session?
Well, it all happened while we were on recess.
Uh-huh.
We had just passed the budget
Right.
in April of 2005,
That'll do
and
it.
well, that might have been it. I don't know, but
Yeah.
the moral of the story is, if you're not feeling well, and the normal home remedies are not working,
Yeah.
don't assume that because you don't have chest pains or
Uh-huh.
other pronounced symptoms that you shouldn't get yourself to a doctor. I was very lucky. I got myself to a doctor, and to my astonishment, I thought I had the flu.
No.
To my astonishment, I had 4 main arteries that were almost entirely blocked.
Wow.
And I didn't know that, and they were able to correct it through
Yeah.
bypass surgery. I'm feeling good.
Good.
All right, thank
Well-
God, that's what you have to say.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, and not belabor it, and that's why I'm leaving it for the end. You knew Shelley Silver very well. Did you know anything about what he was doing? You know, Preet Bharara called the rank and file assemblymen enablers. I mean, is that unfair?
I think it's unfair. You know, I've asked myself at times the question, if were I there today, you know, I've been out 11 years, and I became aware of this, what would I have said, what would I have done? I'm not sure. I'll just say this. Shelley Silver, in his time as speaker, did a lot of very good things. He evidently did a number of things that were intended to enrich himself. And as such, he's about to be sentenced for those actions that were defined by a court as crimes.
Were you surprised by that? Were you floored?
I was, because the Shelley Silver, who I knew very well and worked very closely with, is a dedicated public official. I think, like a lot of other people in a lot of industries, sometimes there are 2, even 3 sides of a person,
Sure.
and the side that I guess went to corruption was a side that I was not aware of, didn't see, and I'm sure there are a lot of things that go on sort of behind the scenes that rank and file members just would not be aware of. But look, at this point in time, not just with Shelley Silver, but with Dean Skelos and
John Sampson,
a parade
yeah.
of other legislators who
Malcolm
have been
Smith,
who have been indicted or convicted. It is incumbent on the legislature to take ethics. They should not leave session this year without passing some really, really meaningful ethics reforms. Now the governor's office is being investigated. The mayor of the city of New York is being investigated, all by Pereira. I think legislators and public officials have to know that the speed limit of 65 is being enforced.
Yeah.
And if you drive 70, you're going to be called to task. A lot of people, you know, like the speed limit, felt that they could sort of step beyond the bounds a little bit. And the story is that no, and you're a public official, you're expected to be absolutely scrupulous and absolutely accountable, and that's what they have to be.
Well, you know, that's what I liked about you, is that you were totally clean and you never did anything that was untoward, and you resisted when the times came. You know, it was just really a pleasure to have you in the legislature. And
Well, I thank you for that,
And
Mark.
I really miss you there, so.
You know, Steve, we're out of time. It was really enlightening. You did great work, as Mark was saying, in the Assembly. I think you're doing greater work as ex-executive director of ACTS, but you continue with your good success and do it with good health.
Yes.
Rabbi, I thank you, and Mark, I thank you very much. This was a terrific experience being with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job.